Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on today's Lunch and Learn on the future of heart transplantation. Today we have two incredible guests who will provide us their insights and information and their unique perspectives on reforms that are currently being proposed by the Organ Procurement Transplantation Network, or OPTN for short. First, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Robert Kormos. Dr. Kormos is currently the Division Vice President of Global Medical Affairs for heart failure at Abbott Laboratory in Texas. He previously served as the Deputy Director of the McGowan Institute of Regenerative Medicine and former chair of the University of Pittsburgh's Medical Center Cardiovascular Transplant and Artificial Heart Program. He's also the past president of the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation. And then later on, we'll be joined by heart transplant recipient and patient advocate Glen Kelley. As Glen will tell you, he experienced a long road to transplantation. He's not only a heart transplant recipient, but also a kidney transplant recipient, and now serves as a member of the OPTN UNOS Heart Transplant Committee and a transplant and MCS leader for the Mended Hearts, Inc. I couldn't think of two better guests to explain the issue and articulate the importance of for bringing in the patient perspective into the public comment period process that's currently underway at OPTN over these changes. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kormos. Dr. Kormos.
Thank you, Scott. Well, it's a real pleasure and privilege for me to be on this call with Glenn, and I in particular appreciate our audience today. You are the focus of why we do what we do in this field. And I want to talk a little bit about how we got to the point that we're at currently in the allocation system and our appreciation of the importance of transplantation, but also how other therapies integrate in advanced heart failure therapy. Next slide. So I think, first of all, let me just get a few definitions out of the road. Heart failure is when a heart is unable to pump enough blood for your body. It's when your organs just don't get enough oxygen from the blood because the heart has become weak. And it's also important to appreciate that heart failure often gets worse before you have an appreciable notice in change of symptoms. And why is that? Well, because as heart failure begins to mount its adverse effects, people adapt their behavior. In other words, you walk a little less farther. You don't travel as much. You don't go shopping. But as you adapt, you can still say you feel okay because you now understand that you can accommodate to your limitations. But then those build up and all of a sudden something happens. So heart failure is a condition where we don't really have a cure. I mean, it leads to hospitalizations. It takes away from your ability to live in the community, interact with your family, and do the things that you normally would have done in the past. And it leads to complications as the heart failure gets worse because your other organs start to fail. And it's also critical to appreciate that heart failure is the most frequent cause of hospitalization for Americans 65 and older. So it's a real problem for healthcare across the United States and, in fact, globally. Next slide. Now, listed here are some of the main symptoms that you may notice when you get heart failure or as it progresses. So you get short of breath because the lungs fill with fluid as the heart can't pump the blood out of the lung to the body. Your general energy level decreases. And as the heart can no longer pump blood from your distal organs or your feet and legs, you notice swelling. You may be lightheaded because your blood pressure is low, and your heart may be faster because as the heart dilates with heart failure and gets weaker, it tries to accommodate by beating faster. And again, as a symptom of the congestion in your lung, you may have frequent coughing. And nausea is often And early satiety, that is feeling like you can't eat anymore, is also a symptom of congestion of your abdominal organs. And finally, as that fluid builds up, you're going to notice that despite controlling your diet, you continue to gain weight. Next slide. So what do we have at Abbott that can help in this? Because your general cardiologist or your heart failure cardiologist will try to control symptoms as best he can by modifying the medications that you get during your heart failure course. We have things like pacemakers and defibrillators. Why? Because we know if we can make the heart beat in a synchronized fashion, that is the right side and the left side, there are two parts to the heart, work in synchrony, it makes you feel better. And also, if you get ventricular arrhythmias, which is uncoordinated electrical activity in the heart, where you can actually have your heart stop, a defibrillator prevents that. We also have tools like the CardioMEMS, which is a small implantable pressure monitor that goes into the pulmonary artery and can tell us, and eventually you, what the pressure is in the pulmonary artery, which is a reflection of your congestion. And that can help a physician make modifications to your therapies without having you be admitted. And finally, if your heart gets so weak that you can no longer do anything or it's affecting your organ function, we have heart pumps called left ventricular assist devices, which help pump in synchrony with your heart the blood into your circulatory system and provides that extra boost that you need. Next. Well, I grew up in an era in the 90s when heart pumps were connected to what looked like a refrigerator. That's how we controlled them, because something had to control the pump, bring it energy and electrical signals, and bring back information to control how it pumped blood. And one of those pumps is in the middle panel, that large 5-pound device that went into your body that helped pump blood from the left ventricle and then distribute it to the aorta. The pump on the right-hand side, which is the HeartMate 3, which is what we're using today, is so much smaller. And the difference is it doesn't pump with a pulsatile mode that the old pumps used to. We can induce some partial artificial pulse, but it is much smaller and fits into your chest much more easily. And if you look at the third panel, you see a patient with an LVAD where you can barely see anything except for a few wires that come out of the body on the right-hand side that connect to her battery and her controller. So in this configuration, people can travel, they can do things that they never did before, get back in the community, exercise, ride a bicycle, work around the house if that's what you're told to do, but you can become a much more normal person. Next slide. So ventricular assist devices can be used in two ways. One is long-term therapy, and that is used, it's used as permanent therapy for people who have heart failure, but have certain characteristics that make heart transplant less advisable. So for example, if you have high antibody levels that make a donor organ less easily accepted by your body, we can wait sometimes up to a year, 2 years, or 3 years till those antibodies disappear. Some patients will also have a cancer within the last couple of years. That malignancy needs to show that it's not going to recur over a period of couple of years. That allows you to get therapy before the transplant that gets you out there and live a normal life. There are other indications, such as patients over the age of 70, where immune suppression can have more serious effects. The area where it has been used a lot is short-term for patients who are awaiting a heart transplant, but get sick so fast that they're going to die within weeks and sometimes days unless we do something for them. And we have short-term devices that can stabilize them, but then an LVAD can keep them active for years sometimes before they get the transplant. Next slide. So what does an LVAD do for you? Well, one thing that's interesting is it allows you to keep your own heart longer. And you may say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, we've actually discovered that some hearts get better when you're on an LVAD. It could take months or years, but we've had patients who feel incredibly well because their own heart begins to contribute to the function with the LVAD. The second thing that's interesting here is that it adds life years. You know, a transplant may give you X number of years, but now you have additive benefit. It allows you to recover from those real sick symptoms of heart failure to make you a better transplant candidate. And as I said, it can extend the total expected life with a transplant. It also gets you home with your family. Many patients go back to work. Yeah, we have all those pictures of LVAD patients playing golf, but if you never played golf before, you're not going to play golf. But it does get you out there and make you more healthy for your future transplant. And they feel better with the LVAD and get back those activities they lost with heart failure. Next slide. So heart transplant surgery is complicated. It replaces your heart with one from an organ donor. And this option is available when medical therapy alone can no longer keep you out of heart failure. In 2022, almost 8,500 people were on the wait list for heart transplant, but fewer than half of those received a heart because there just aren't enough donors. And we get this information from UNOS. Next slide. And this gives you an appreciation of just how far behind we are in helping you all out there with heart failure. About over 80% of patients are not treated with an LVAD or get a heart transplant, which means there's a huge shortfall and a gap in our ability to help patients like yourselves. So heart transplants don't come up every day. Part of that is because there's strict criteria for selecting what's called a good donor. Next slide. And here's, since 1988, you can see the rate of heart transplantation annually here. And it's grown, but not at the rate that heart failure and end-stage heart failure is growing. Perhaps we're going to get 4,000 transplants this year, but that's still short of the target. Next slide. So where are we now? Well, one thing that physicians always have tried to do was provide a system. If there aren't enough hearts, you have to make decisions about how do you decide who gets a heart first. And they developed an allocation policy before October 2018, which just had 3 categories. And what happened is everybody was lumped into this first 1A category. And it was extremely unfair to certain groups of patients. So after October 18th, 2018, physicians got together and developed a system that now had 6 categories. The highest risk is those who are on extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO. This is like being on a heart-lung machine. Or you had to have a pump that supported both the right and the left side. Status 2 was a pump that you couldn't leave hospital with. So if you had to stay in hospital till your transplant, then that was a high status. An intra-aortic balloon pump, which is a pump that goes through your femoral artery in your groin, helps reduce the workload to the heart, and you can have that for a couple weeks, up to 3 weeks. And finally, there are percutaneous LVADs, such as the Impella, which goes across the aortic valve, decompresses the left ventricle, and can also keep you going for a number of weeks. Then, if you've got a straightforward LVAD who then gets a complication, the complications include infection or stroke, which is rare but still can happen, then you can place a LVAD patient into that higher status group. Otherwise, you're in status 4. And there are other programs that will doubly list you to try and optimize the chance of getting an organ. Now, what is happening currently, what Glen's going to get into here, is people have looked at this and said, it's time to take advantage of the knowledge that we've gained from this system in 2018 till now, and let's figure out what we've learned works the best, and let's try to improve on the system, again, to make it more equitable for you. That's my last slide. I'll turn it over to Glen, and I'm very happy to answer questions. I'm sure there'll be a few that come up, but we're here to help you understand the current system and where we're going.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kormos, for kind of really helping us understand that. system. And I think that we will certainly get into questions after Glenn's presentation. And now I'm very excited to introduce Glenn. Glenn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott. And Dr. Kormos, thank you for that great information you shared with us. So I'm a heart transplant recipient, as Scott talked about, and also a kidney transplant recipient. And I'll talk about my journey in a little bit. But what the focus of my conversation with you today is going to be how you can affect the future of heart transplant. Okay. So you have the power, to help change what we have in place, help improve it, and so forth. So Scott, go ahead and go to the next slide. A few things for information for everyone here. First, as Dr. Kormos outlined, there is a greater need than is currently available for all organs, and in particular, today we're talking about heart. And just to give you an idea, he shared one statistic, I'll share another from 2001. There were 6,700 people died while waiting for a heart transplant. So how can we make this system more efficient to help those that are most urgent, as well as to help those that might be disadvantaged in some other way? And we'll get into some of that. We'll talk about how is this regulated. We'll talk about, as Dr. Kormos introduced, the system is ever evolving, and got some illustrations for you on that. And talk about how you can impact the future of heart transplant. Scott, next slide. Okay, so let me share with you for a few minutes my story. My story actually began in 1984 when I was diagnosed with stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was the week before my senior year of high school, where I then underwent both chemotherapy and radiation. I was in remission until 1986 once I was in college, and it was determined that I needed a bone marrow transplant. Those were still very experimental at the time. So I went to the University of Nebraska to have that done, whereas I had, been living in Illinois, downstate Illinois, for most of my adolescence and childhood. So from there, I had a successful bone marrow transplant and went on and did what a typical 19, 20, 21-year-old and so forth would do, and that's live. And graduated college, went on, got married, but relatively normal life. I like to be active, and as you can see in the picture, I enjoyed hiking and climbing. And this is a note, I think, for everyone. Heart disease can hit anywhere at any time without suspecting it. So one week in August, I just summited Half Dome, crawled around some other rocks for a week, went home and felt like I had the flu. And only because I had a friend who was a nurse who I happened to be out having some fun with. She's like, no, we need to go to the ER. I'm like, what do you mean you go to the ER? I don't need to go to the ER. I went to the ER, and sure enough, I was having a heart attack. And that began my heart journey. Later, much later, we found that, this heart attack and my following heart condition was attributed to those cancer treatments. From there, I had a series of stents placed. And eventually, as some may know, you can only stent over a stent so many times. And then in 2013, needed a bypass. So I continued to live. And then in 2015, early 15, realized, no, I was starting to show signs of heart failure. And so, this is a story of then how precious is it to receive a transplant. Our physicians will do everything to help fix us without getting to transplant if possible, right? So I was in a condition where I needed to have my aortic valve replaced, my mitral valve replaced, and my tricuspid valve repaired. They also performed another bypass and a radical pericardectomy because my pericardium had adhered to my lungs due to the long-term treatment issues from before. Unfortunately, at the end of all of that, a few months later, we determined, no, I was suffering from what was called restrictive cardiomyopathy. And so thus I would need a new heart. So I began the workup, and I actually was admitted as a stage 1A patient in the first week of December 2015. Now remember, this was the prior allocation system that Dr. Kormos had mentioned earlier. And in that, what happened and ensued had been months of waiting and waiting and waiting. Eventually, I was actually transferred to another hospital in Texas from the University of Minnesota, down to Texas, where I then eventually received a transplant. And coming out of transplant, I ran into complications. So much like I'd had complications that had grown while I was waiting, had I had received a heart right when I kind of needed one at the beginning, I might not have had many of those complications. One of those most noteworthy is I lost kidney function. So I began dialysis. Eventually, I was discharged. But before I left, I'd been in for so long and developed a lot of relationships with a lot of people in the hospital. So I decided to throw not one discharge party, but two, for the night shift and the day shift. And here's a pro tip for anyone spending time in the hospital. Hawaiian shirts work great for cardiology patients. They have access to the leads, and your telemetry box will fit right in the pocket. Finally, 3 years later, I did receive a kidney transplant after 3 years of dialysis. Made friends through that. It was one of the hardest things I ever had to do was endure dialysis. And there's a takeaway from that. I'm so thankful, of course, that I received a kidney transplant, but the listing and allocation policies changed after I'd received my heart. Just as it had been updated in 18, as you saw earlier, the ability to more easily receive a kidney around the same time as your heart became much easier, such that if I would have had that condition today, I would have actually received a heart and a kidney at the same time, thus preventing 3 years of dialysis. Next slide. So now on to where we are today. Here's some background for you. Congress passed it. We went into law, the National Organ Transplant Act in 1984. So much of this, everything we're talking about today is actually hard-coded in the U.S. law. With that, the Organ Procurement Transplant Network was formed. And this is a policy group that's made up of professionals from the transplant community. They're physicians, doctors, transplant coordinators, and patients. So as part of that policy is available public comment. And we're going to talk about public comment in a couple of slides. Go ahead and next slide for now. And just so you know, this is kind of general rule of business as it relates to federal agencies. So just as you can see on the slide, the Administrative Protection Act of 1946 requires public input for proposed rulemaking for many agencies. And that's included under Health and Human Services, and then the Bureau of HRSA, as it's called, within that. That's the federal governing body that then is responsible for organ transplant. So we're currently in a new public comment period that began last week. These happen every 6 months. And there are two particular proposals that are up for discussion. Next slide. The first is mechanical device requirements for status 2. I'm going to talk about that just for a quick moment. So the LVADs that Dr. Kormos referenced, those are mechanical devices. And in policy lingo, that's referred to as durable medical devices, right? You can go out, you can play golf, you can go to the store, you can live your life. However, this particular one has to do with the non-durable devices, and we'll talk more about those. The second proposal is then to introduce what's called continuous distribution. It is a single framework that all organs are moving to for transplant. Currently, lung has already been implemented back this spring. The next due up is going to be kidney later this year. Next slide. So let me give you a current reference for the first change, actually for both changes. So this is the wait list, what it looked like over the last 2 years. As Dr. Kormos mentioned earlier, there are 6 statuses. If you're looking at this, you'll see, wow, there's a lot of people sitting at status 2. Now, if you're unable to see, the light color is 2022, where the darker red is 21. So we see that status 2 is even growing. And why is that? Well, one thing I'll tell you is there's been a 70% increase in the use of these non-durable devices. Okay, we're going to talk about those more in a moment. The second thing I want to indicate for you, we know that LVADs are an incredibly successful and stable solution for patients. Well, if you're a healthy LVAD, you're sitting down there at status 4, we're seeing a decreased use of LVAD. And some of this is kind of what's commonly been referred to over time as gaming the system. So back in 2016, when I was waiting for a heart, typically, they would game the system. They would put a Swan catheter in a patient. They'd sit in the ICU because that way, that's the highest probability of ability to get the heart. It wasn't necessarily reflective of your medical urgency. It was just the quickest way to get a heart. The purpose of these statuses is to reflect medical urgency, right? Those most urgent should receive a heart the quickest, right? So there's we've lost some balance in the system when we look at status 2, and we'll peel that back more in a moment. One other note before we go to the next slide, and that is the next topic we talk about with continuous distribution takes this idea of medical urgency and makes that a component into many more items to help bring greater equity to the transplant system as well. Next slide. Okay, so a little more. Why is this proposal in place? First of all, we've seen that's this substantial increase in what you see as IABP. Think of it as just balloon pump. That's intra-aortic balloon pump. Goes up through the femur. You have to be hospitalized. They're designed to be used 2 to 3 weeks. What we're finding is some patients are on them even longer now. So the challenge was these devices are being used without actually using medicine first. So inotropes are a category of medications, dobutamine is an example, that a person in advanced heart failure would typically have in order to treat their advanced heart failure. The system was designed so that introduce medicine less invasive before going directly to some mechanical device. So that's currently being ignored. Second is we believe that by making this change, it will better properly align with the medical urgency that's been defined around status 2. We also want to increase access for those that truly are at status 2, because that will increase their outcomes. One of the metrics that is always measured through all of this, and as a member of the OPTN committee, we receive frequently are, what are the mortality numbers while waiting for a heart? Our goal is 0, but that's not realistic. But the lower we can make that number, the better life is for everyone. So in essence, we're proposing to say that a physician must demonstrate the use of a medical therapy, medicine, an inotropic therapy, prior to a balloon pump. They also must show that they've been able to wean off inotropes, or they'll go back to maybe a status 3. Okay, so then, and by the way, all of this does not mean that the person is not on a list. It simply means the person is dropped to a status 3 instead of a status 2, because it's more reflective of what their true medical urgency is. 2 last things. One, Dr. Kormos referred to an Impella or a percutaneous device. It functions differently, but helps solve the same problem for a heart and advanced heart failure. We're not seeing those issues as far as a device being used to game the system per se today. However, we're going to apply the same rules so that that does not become the next balloon pump, so to speak. Finally, there is an ability to address emergency one-off situations. Next. Next topic, I'm going to talk about a concept paper that is available. And by the way, all of this information is available in greater detail on the OPTN website, where you'll see a QR code at the end of this presentation. Know that there's also patient-facing materials there as well, so it's not all Dr. Mumbo Jumbo stuff. So continuous distribution is a new approach to organ allocation. And the goal of this is very simple. Let's make it more fair, and let's make it more equitable. Let's also get efficiencies across organ transplant so that we're actually using a single system. Okay, as we talked about earlier, the current system is based on those classification statuses. It also includes distance. So distance from the donor hospital. Okay, I'll show you a chart on that in just a moment. So the next part is this classification will be replaced by what's called a points-based system. Okay, and we'll talk about attributes. Those are the attributes that will start to make up. That's the granular portion of this new system. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned on the left, I apologize, the words are small, but that's where you actually can see the classifications of status 1 through 6, also layered in how many nautical miles from a transplant, from a donor is an offer. And so that's the priority list. It's actually quite linear when you break it down. And that determines who's next based on time is a factor. The next one takes a series of components or attributes, builds them together so that each patient candidate receives a series of numbers or points against a single match. And so we're going to talk about what are all these things, but in essence, you'll have a different set of points based on every different donor run that comes across. This can become much more granular, thus increasing fairness. And we'll talk about what are those contents. Next slide, please. So the score. Now we're starting to peel back the onion just a little bit for you. So it's called a composite allocation score. Just think of it as the point system. Okay. For each patient, their score is going to change from donor to donor based on the attributes, the components within that, like how many points they get from them. So as you can see in this chart, they fall into categories. The first one is medical urgency. Now, medical urgency is the system we use today, status 1 through 6. That's essentially medical urgency, and we're not changing any of that. We're going to apply that in a points-based way. A second one that's starting to look at is what's the survival of the graft itself or the donated organ? What's probabilities of that? It's actually something that's done within lung transplant today and has been practiced for quite a while. So those are some things that are being looked at. Candidate biology, blood types. This is very important. So I happen to be an O blood type. Everybody loves O blood types because they're universal donors. They're universal donors of blood. They're universal donors of organs. However, if you're an O, you can only receive an O organ. So O's wait the longest. If you're an AB, hey, it's great. Gimme, gimme, gimme. You can get a donation. You can receive an organ from anyone. So that's not really fair. So let's give some points to flatten that out a bit. Okay, that's one example of the biology. We'll talk more about some of these others in an upcoming slide as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into these a little more. And I'm giving you this just as a brief summary, and the detail within this is in the paper. It's also on a presentation that's on the OPTN site that I did with a fellow member of the OPTN committee, a fellow patient member, Earl Lovell. He was a transplant recipient out of Northern California. And in essence, for medical urgency, so statuses we talked about, also the pediatric statuses are being woven into this. A quick note on pediatrics as well. The numbers I showed earlier were for adult. I used only adult as a reference to really simplify our conversation today. Okay, we have the data on pediatrics as well. There's been some really great changes within the pediatric world over the last couple of years, and most notably, most recently, the ability to transplant a donor's heart from an incompatible blood type to another pediatric patient. That actually happens today now. And that policy was updated recently, earlier this year. And so I'd love to come back sometime and focus exclusively on the pediatric heart patients if people would like that. But know that there'll be attributes specifically and points specifically as a pediatric patient. If you're retransplanted, again, points associated with that. Congenital heart disease. Maybe you're an adult that have had CHD your entire life. Things involved with that. The next two, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, restrictive cardiomyopathy, those are currently included in current policy, and those will be pulled forward as well. They measure differently than those with, say, one who has a traditional congestive heart failure, as an example. The last, second to last one there is a term that many people, unless you've received a heart transplant, you may not be familiar. Cardiac allograft vasculopathy is a conditioning of the thickening of the arterial walls of the heart that happens to some transplant patients. Some it happens much more than others, and it's a condition that is not solved by statins, like your typical calcification that would happen in an artery. So that's a condition, again, that we want to have an attribute for. And finally, waiting time on LVAD. I want to talk specifically to the LVAD community for a moment. So time on VAD. I know some people have had LVADs for 4 years. They're still waiting for hearts. I know some people have had 2 years waiting for hearts. I know 5 years waiting for hearts. And there's some challenges in that. You can see that on the slide earlier. We talked about the different statuses and the wait list on there. So how about giving credit for time on VAD? That will happen in continuous distribution. And I also want to make a note here as well to know that just like we made the adjustments, or we're making the adjustments for mechanical devices, right, the non-durable mechanical devices right now, we actually have a subcommittee working on incorporating time on VAD into the current status system. Nothing to announce today, but we hope to have something to be able to talk to you about soon. Okay, as you can probably read some of these others. I just want to hit on a few things. Wait time. How do we account for wait time? Patient access. That means access to organ. Okay. Again, you see priority for pediatrics, priority for living donors. Let's say you're a good Samaritan. You donated a kidney, or you donated part of your liver. You're going to get credit for that. That's a standard across all the organs as we implement continuous distribution. Finally, is an important one for the system, and that is how efficient is the organ donated, is the organ transplant process. So how close are they together? Is it a matter of transporting a heart 500 miles from, say, Chicago to Minneapolis? Or is it a matter of sending it 1,500 plus miles and going from New York to LA? One's far more efficient than others. So that's going to be accounted for. That also simplifies the logistics within the chain. Again, reducing error. Let's go ahead and go forward. Okay, so where are we now? So remember, I talked earlier about the policy process. We're in public comment. I want to show where are we in the development of continuous distribution. So we're actually building rating scales on identifying the attributes. You know, those boxes you see at the bottom, that's the sausage making. Something pretty neat worth sharing is you see where you see those circular modeling and analysis. That's actually where OPTN UNOS has partnered with MIT for some leading machine learning and AI capabilities to run the modeling for this new system. It's not being done by pen. It's not being done by an Excel spreadsheet. It's some really high-end machine learning work, and it's really fascinating. So we're using some of that. You can expect this to be implemented in 2027. Next slide. Okay, so now how can you comment? How can you provide your feedback? Right here you can see the address optn.transplant.hrsa.gov, or there's a convenient QR code right here. And simply go there and you'll find, right under the policies, public comment. Next slide. And then also, volunteering is open right now. Okay. So there's a great opportunity. I just applied online. That's how I got involved. I felt a need based on my experience that I wanted to help others, and I wanted to do it through this process. We welcome all of you to apply. So that period is open right now for the next month or so. And so I encourage you to get involved, any kind of background. If you're working and you happen to have an IT background, great, could use you. If you happen to be, a family member of someone who donated, great. If you happen to be a family member of someone who received a transplant, great. If you just have a strong interest, great. Everyone can apply, and it's open for everyone. And next slide. And this brings us to our Q&A. So it's been a great time spending time with all of you for this session. And I look forward to our upcoming conversation as Scott comes back online here.
Hey, thanks so much, Glenn.
And soon we'll see Dr. Kormos in a minute as well.
Yeah, thanks for both of your presentations. They're incredibly helpful. I think what the big takeaway here is, Glenn, is just the importance of patients getting involved, right? Like, you have laid out a very thoughtful process of how these heart transplants are distributed, but until you need one, you probably don't know kind of the intricacies of it. Can you just speak a little bit, like, from your perspective, both of you, what is the value, as you see it, of the patients getting involved in making comments on the current changes that are being proposed, as well as the future ones? Why is it so important for patients to get involved? And I'll send it to Glenn first, and then have Dr. Kormos answer it.
Thanks, Scott. It's really simple, guys. If we have any patients on the call here, you have something that no physician has. You know what it feels like. And that is a unique perspective. And I have to tell you, I've been a part of the OPTN committee for just over a year. And I've been welcomed with open arms, as has every other one of my patient colleagues and non-patient colleagues. It's that diversity in thought. And so I extend that to you. You have this forum. You can advocate for the greater heart community without leaving your laptop at home. Or your iPad, for that matter. It's that simple.
Yeah, I think what Glenn said is really crucial for everybody to understand is the power is in you. You are the ultimate beneficiary of this process. And so it's so critical to provide feedback to the system to make sure they understand your perspective, because you can make change.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I definitely think that is really the tenet of the action network of Mended Hearts, is really that we were developed to be able to be that patient voice and to kind of bring these kind of opportunities where patient voices are needed, so that we can advocate on behalf of the patient community and really help them understand, help policymakers, whether that's OPTN or federal government or CMS, really understand where the patient's perspective is on certain issues. We have a couple of questions that came in from Facebook and other places. I'm going to take Lord's question first. She had asked a question about where can we see the classification-based system chart. Glenn, I think this was in your slide deck. Is there a place that we can direct folks to where this current classification-based system is?
You can see that exact chart I used at the OPTN website for continuous distribution, our proposal, right? So if you hit provide feedback, you'll see that exact slide that you can download as a PDF. I'll show you that one exactly. You'll also find a reference to it elsewhere if you look under heart transplant under the OPTN site.
Great. And we'll be sure to share the link to OPTN's public comment period, so you can go in a little bit more deeply on the proposed amendment. There's a 16-page document. There is a general proposal information for patients specifically. I think this was really to try to bring general awareness to the Mended Hearts community that changes are happening at the OPTN and that patient voice and patient perspective is needed. to make a more fair and equitable distribution system. I'm going to take a couple more questions here, from Dr. Bill asked, and this is potentially a question for Dr. Kormos. How does it work for a person in their early 80s to qualify for a heart transplant under the current system? Is there an age cutoff?
So great question. Every transplant program, based on its own personal experience, will develop its own internal guidelines on their criteria for transplantation. In general, I can tell you that, there's not a lot of question up to age 70. As you get over age 70, some programs begin to look at specific other criteria. For example, how much peripheral vascular disease do you have? Do you have a lot of calcification in the arteries in your body, especially the arteries to the brain, where a major procedure could put you at risk for stroke? And they look at the other end organ function, and they look at the type of life that a person has led. Are they active? Do they have the potential of utilizing an organ in a way that will give them extended life and a good quality of life, because they had that before they got heart failure? So I don't think there are really strict criteria. We know, again, that every center will make its own decisions based on its experience and on the individual evaluation of the patient. So is there an absolute cutoff? Many programs will tell you, no, I do an individual assessment based on the patient and their risk factors.
Great. All right, last question to you both, because we're right at time. This week, both the House and the Senate have passed OPTN reform legislation. Heart transplant in general is a hot topic in Washington, where I'm based out of. What is your immediate take on, what do you see as the future of kind of coming out of these reforms? And what do you hope for that?
Well, let me just add a perspective here that last year, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine commissioned or did a report on transplantation in general. And they identified some areas that could be improved. And this goes everywhere from the infrastructure to the IT support that exists. I mean, it covered a lot of topics. And I think there are areas that are ripe for improvement. And I think having this competitive framework really will look for solutions that people bring to the table that answer some of the challenges that came out in that national report. And let's be clear, the system has opportunities for improvement, the infrastructure, but it's all about creating an equitable system. And I think that's what's on the minds of everybody, both equitable and equal. And I think they're two different words there, but they cross barriers everywhere, from gender to race, to patient size even. So I think there's a lot of things that have to be considered. And I think this competitive spirit may allow us to find solutions for some of the things that report brought. Glenn, your thoughts?
Thank you, Dr. Kormos. First, I couldn't support any more what you had to say there. I agree categorically. I think in addition, what's mindful is, one, there's positive focus on the process. Two, change isn't easy, and that's what we're embarking on. Three, UNOS is on the record of supporting this competitivization that's talked about, and that's important. As a patient and as a representative within the patient community, I only see upside in the ability to bring multiple ideas to help make the system, as Dr. Kormos said, more equitable, more equal, more fair for everyone. And last but not least, I think it's important and mindful to know that through the process, we cannot lose institutional knowledge. There are processes that have been placed for 30 years. Some have been improved upon and some haven't. But there's knowledge there that if that's not properly leveraged, we're making a mistake. And so that's the one takeaway to remember as well. And as a patient community, I believe we'll have input into some of that. And so as a patient takeaway, if you want to think about it twofold, one is this is very positive, right? There's some much needed focus in the space in particular. Two, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think we can all identify with that.
Great. Well, thank you to everybody who joined us today. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Dr. Kormos. This has been a very enlightening conversation. And, you know, on behalf of Mended Hearts, we look forward to getting involved in this, further involved in this discussion around the current OPTN proposed changes and the future of continuous distribution, as well as looking at as the reforms are implemented out of this week's legislation. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.